and the territories they have traditionally occupied. We recognize and deeply appreciate the historic connection they have to this place, the land, the water, the sky, and all that live in, on, and above it. We are grateful for the opportunity to meet here, and we thank all the generations of Indigenous peoples who have taken care of this place and who continue to care for it, and we want to show our respect. Hundreds of years after the first treaties were signed, they remain relevant today. May they guide our actions and our decisions. We commit to learn, to educate, to honor sacred places, and to take action towards real truth and reconciliation. Miigwech. Council, any declarations of pecuniary interest? All right, I'm not seeing any. Before we get into our deputation, the first thing I'd like to do is, one, observe there are 3 councillors in chambers and 4 online, so we have the full house, so to speak. And we have a new member in our chambers, namely Jasvinder Radigan, our new Director of Financial Services. I just want to say welcome aboard, and I guess you're going in with both feet first when we're doing development charges as your first public appearance, if I can call it that, with us. But we're very glad to have you on board and look forward to working with you. Welcome. So we have a deputation, development charges background study from Hemson Consulting, and with us is their associate partner, Stefan. Oh, I almost had it before, Krzeczunowicz, or if you will, Stefan K. Mr. K. Before I make an even worse mess of your name, please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. As you said, I'm a partner with Hemson Consulting in Toronto. We've been retained by the township to prepare a development charges background study for you. This is being coordinated with the other lower tier municipalities in the district, all of whose development charge bylaws expire at some point this year. You're one of the first to be proceeding, along with Bracebridge and Muskoka Lakes, and then Huntsville and Gravenhurst will be completed later in the year, and the district is also undertaking a development charge study process as well. So the purpose of today really is to give you a bit of background to development charges, how they're used in the township. Normally, I wouldn't spend too much time talking about the legislation and the rules governing development charges, but there's been quite a lot of change to that legislation since the last time the township did a background study in 2019. So I am going to spend a few minutes speaking about those changes because they do have implications for how we've done the study, but also how you collect and administer the charges here. I'll then talk about what we're going to do for the study and the 2 main inputs into the calculation of the rates. One is the forecast of future development, and the other is the list of projects that you intend to pay for through development charges. I'll show you a draft summary of the development charge rates that we've calculated on the basis of the projects that have been put together. I'll show you how those rates compare to what others are charging in the district and a bit further afield. And then we'll talk finally about the steps that are required to get you from here to the passage of a new bylaw. We'll have a resolution for you today to consider, to receive the information that I'm presenting and direct us to proceed with drafting a background study on the basis of that information. So what are we talking about when we talk about development charges? Well, these are charges that are imposed on developers to pay for growth-related capital costs. So capital costs only, not operating expenditures, and only to the extent that capital is needed to expand the capacity of your existing facilities or infrastructure to maintain levels of service in the face of growth. The district has its own development charges for its services. You have separate development charges under a separate bylaw for your services. And there are also charges in place that are imposed by the school boards for new land for school sites. But we are focused today only on the area municipal charge, the township charge. And the principle behind them is that growth should pay for itself, so that the burden of the cost of expansion of facilities is not borne by your existing taxpayers. Development charges are imposed under a bylaw, and the current bylaw that you have, as I said, was passed in 2019. It expires on June the 10th of this year, and it imposes charges for the services that are shown sort of the top part of the screen here. So you have a library, fire, parks and recreation, general government, and roads and related. So just a word about these services. In 2019, the Act had a list of services you couldn't charge for. Now it's got a list of services that you can charge for. All of your current services are on that list, except for the one with the asterisk, the general government. That's a service that's for which you collect money to pay for growth-related studies. And that's now ineligible for DC funding. However, Minister Calandra a few months ago announced that he was going to review again some of the changes he had made to the Act. And one of the things he specified was that he was going to look at reintroducing the general government category, the studies category, as an eligible service. So we've calculated a charge for you just in case those changes come up in the next few weeks. If they do, it'll be in our study. You can put it in your bylaw. If they don't, we'll just leave it off. So just bear that in mind. Prior to passing the new bylaw, you have to undertake a background study. That's what we've been retained to do for you, and hold at least one public meeting. And we've sort of tentatively scheduled that for May. The new bylaw will be a 10-year bylaw, whereas the old one was a 5-year bylaw. That's been another change. And after the bylaw is passed, there's 40 days where anyone can appeal the rates or any of the policies in the bylaw, and those appeals are heard at the Ontario Land Tribunal. So I do want to, as I said, spend a bit of time speaking about the changes to the Act, because, well, as well as being having a direct impact on the way we do the study, you know, these changes are an important component of this Conservative government's plan to address housing affordability in Ontario. And I know that's top of mind with many of the councils up in Muskoka and further afield. So just a bit of background here. So in its last term, the government introduced a housing supply action plan. It introduced several pieces of legislation intended to limit development charges. So that was this Bill 108, Bill 197. There was a few other pieces of legislation as well. In the run-up to the last election, it struck a housing affordability task force, whose recommendations in the winter of 2022 became a pretty important platform, if not the key part of the platform of the government's June 2022 election mandate, which was to improve affordability generally and build 1.5 million homes in Ontario over the next 10 years. And one of the stated ways of doing that was to reduce housing costs by reducing municipal fees, including development charges. And to that end, the government introduced legislation late in 2022 that implemented significant development charge exemptions, phase-ins, and discounts. And this was through Bill 23, the More Homes Built Faster Act, which I'm sure you'll have heard of. So I'm just going to go through some of those changes to the development charge framework brought about by Bill 23. Some of these are in force. Some of them are not yet in force. So there are, as I said, exemptions from the payment of the charges for affordable and attainable housing, subject to certain criteria. So if it's rental housing, in order to qualify, it has to be below 80% of the average market rent in any particular area. If it's an owner-occupied unit, it has to be less than 80% of the average purchase price for any particular area. And there's also an income threshold that the owners have to meet in order to qualify. This is not in force yet. I think the province realizes that in order to do this properly, it needs to do it regionally to reflect the differences in rents and house prices that are in place in Ontario. And it's going to be issuing bulletins that identify the different regions and the different criteria for each region. And those bulletins have not been issued yet for the affordable housing. The attainable housing has not even been defined yet. So that work is underway, and we expect that to be part of the minister's next update to the Act. There are, however, exemptions that.
Can I just interrupt for a moment? Would you like to take questions during your presentation? You want to wait until the end?
I'm in your hands, Mr. Mayor. I'm happy to do either.
Because I see Councillor Hazelton has his hand up, so we'll let him ask his question.
Sure.
Thank you. So you're talking about attainable and affordable housing. So one of the things that I think we grapple with is what the definitions of those are. And you said something about 80%. But one of the things that I think is challenging for us in our township is we are a seasonal resort destination. And any property that seems to be carved out is immediately market priced in a comparative vein based on the fact that it's basically cottage country. And so I struggle with understanding how in our township, except in a couple of hamlets, how we could embrace this affordable, attainable housing concept. Could you offer some comments on that, given that you've already done some studies here?
Well, through you, Mr. Mayor. I think it's going to be, I think it's clear that coming up with a province-wide definition of affordable and attainable for the purposes of the development charges exemption has been a challenge, which is why it's taken well over a year for the province to come up with the right framework for implementing it. And part of the reason is the problem that you've just identified, which is that not only do the actual purchase prices and market rents fluctuate significantly from one place to the next throughout the province, there are some areas and municipalities such as yourselves where there's huge variation within the jurisdiction itself, because you have, you know, homes with very high assessment here that are perhaps seasonal and waterfront, and you have others that are well, not quite so high, but certainly the difference between the two is quite substantial. I think that's why in the most recent consultation that the province has done on this matter, they've introduced an income threshold into the mix when determining to see whether someone's going to qualify or not. But I really can't be too definitive as to how they're going to come to settle on, this, regional framework that they want to put into place. I don't know whether it's going to be municipality specific. I don't know whether it's going to be a little bit broader than that. Maybe it might cover sort of upper tier county and district level approaches. So I don't know, but I can say that they've looked very carefully at this and they've wrestled with the problem. Ultimately, I think their purpose is the same, is aligned with a lot of municipal councils, in that they want to make sure that the initial cost of construction for affordable, whatever that turns out to be, is minimized. I'm afraid that's all I can say about it until we hear more.
Thank you. Councillor Cooper.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you for the report so far. I just have a couple of quick questions before we get too far into this. The first one goes back to page 3, if you don't mind, if you can get there quickly. You talked about the 5 categories where charges can be imposed, but the general government one was up in the air at the moment, so to speak. And I just and one of the things is, well, there'll be a determination, but should we be calculating that general government number that we had in 2019 within the other 4 categories so that we cover off our costs, so to speak?
Yeah, through you, Mr. Mayor, that's a very good question. We've looked very closely at that. There are studies that are included in the other categories. So, for example, in the fire category, we've included a fire master plan. So service-specific studies are included. Those, however, will have to be stripped out if the change isn't made that we hope for. So the general government category right now just contains planning studies. So you know, there's no moving the chess pieces around in order to avoid the prohibition, I'm afraid. And that's the long and the short of it.
Okay, thank you for that. Just thought we could try. Anyway, the second thing was you talked about there's still going to be a determination as to geographic areas, sort of some mapping pertaining to the municipalities and where they fall. And that's going to be, as we've seen maybe in the past, a rather important aspect to this, where we get lumped into one area versus another. In other words, at the moment, we'd probably be considered all of Ontario, but also Southern Ontario, and really we're, I think, fairly distinct from Southern Ontario, particularly the GTA. And so my question around that is there any benefit or any way that we can lobby the government to suggest that places like the township of Georgian Bay, which, you know, from especially a north-south perspective, we're not all that different from areas north of us, but we are distinctive and quite different from areas south of us, which are much more urbanized, shall we say, versus, you know, sort of open waterfront areas. And that sort of runs all the way up to the north end of Georgian Bay, but across and up into Lake Superior. So we are probably more like Northern Ontario or Central Ontario, let's say. Is there any potential for lobbying the government to make sure that we don't fall into the wrong category?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, I think right now there's no formal path for making that kind of submission. There have been windows of consultation that the province have opened over the last 18 months to get feedback on how things should be structured. I've been a part of some of those consultations. My feeling is that the province, certainly at the staff level, is well aware that some kind of regional approach needs to be made. The challenge that they're wrestling with is whether they have the data to do things at a very granular level. And there's also the practicality of, you know, tracking and updating and maintaining these bulletins at a very granular level, which they have elected to take on themselves. So I think they're going to find the balance between trying to get things to be fair and also making sure that they have the right data to ensure that you know, they have the right level of granularity. And we're still waiting to see what the solution is that they come up with.
So just a quick follow-up, Mr. Mayor, if I may, and that is just to say that would there be not any benefit for us to raise these concerns with the ministry and the minister to say, there needs to be some consideration to areas that are not really urban at all. And we would like to make sure that we fall within a non-urban waterfront specific type of area.
I'd say let's get the presentation completed, and then at the end, when we're contemplating motions, we may want to entertain additional motions. Let's get through I think the presentation before we get into any discussion like that. Go ahead, please.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Excuse me. So just going to skip forward now again to the list of exemptions that are now in force. So where you have housing units that are created in existing rental buildings, these are buildings that are going to have 4 or more units in them. You can add up to 1 unit or 1% of the existing units, and you'll be exempt from the payment of the charges. You'll also be exempt where units are created in existing homes, either through duplexing or triplexing, or adding ancillary units that are separate from the main home. So those will all be exempt as well. Non-profit housing is exempt, and units that are part of inclusionary zoning are also exempt. There are also discounts that are in place for rental housing. So this is purpose-built rental. Again, it must have 4 or more units. And if they are 3-bedroom units, they get a 25% discount on the rate. It's a 20% discount if there's 2 bedrooms, and a 15% discount for every unit that's 1 bedroom or a bachelor. And then on top of the very specific exemptions and discounts, there's a blanket mandatory phase-in of the entire rate for all the services that kicks in when you pass the bylaw. So when you pass the bylaw in June, if you pass the bylaw in June, in the first year of the bylaw's existence, you will only be able to charge 80% of the maximum rate. In year 2, it'll be 85% of the maximum rate, year 3, 90%, year 4, 95%, and then from years 5 to 10, only then will you be able to impose the full rate that you can. That, by the way, that provision, by the way, is also one of the ones that the minister has said he's going to review as part of the current update. So there are some other changes, which I won't get into in too much detail. Suffice to say that as well as the ineligible services, there's a way we have to calculate service levels that's slightly different from the way we did it 5 years ago. I mentioned also that the DC bylaw lifespans have been extended from 5 to 10 years. There's changes to the way the DCs are collected. So previously, they were collected and paid on the day that a building permit was issued. And the new act still provides for the payment at the time of the building permit, but it changes the date of when the charge is calculated to the date you apply for either your rezoning or your site plan approval. So, i.e., the date at which it's calculated is potentially much earlier than when you pull your permit. Also, for rental housing and institutional development charges are paid in annual installments, 5 of them, from the time of occupancy of the building. And moreover, for your roads service, you must now spend or allocate at least 60% of the reserve funds that you have on hand for that service each year. So the key word there is allocate, by the way. So, I mean, allocating just simply means that on any given year, you will have to, review the amounts you have in the reserve funds and indicate your intentions as to what you want to do with at least 60% of those funds. So I'm just going to spend a time talking about the background study. So the legislation is quite prescriptive about how this is to be done. Step 1 is to do a forecast of future development. Step 2 is to identify the infrastructure needs of the future development. I mentioned service levels because we then have to look backwards in time over the last 15 years and determine the level of service that's been provided in the township, because that will set a limit on how much you can fund moving forward. We have to cost the new infrastructure and facilities, and we have to identify any grants you might receive to pay for those costs, the extent to which those costs are going to benefit your existing residents, because that benefit to existing share is ineligible for DC funding. We have to account for any reserve funds you have on hand that you can use to pay for those costs. And then to the extent that some infrastructure might be benefiting development beyond the planning horizon that we're looking at, we have to also account for those so-called post-period benefits. And ultimately, we're left with a pool of costs that's eligible for development charge funding, and the costs are recovered as a charge per unit on the residential sector, with larger charges for larger units, and then as a charge per square meter of new building floor space on the non-residential sector. This is the development forecast that we've been working with to calculate the rates that we have for you today. It's the responsibility of the district, as you know, to allocate population and employment to the lower tier municipalities. So it's the district that's doing this work, and it's still in draft, but we will be using it for your work and for the Muskoka Lakes work and for the Bracebridge work. You can see the table here. The growth that's being projected right now is about 31 units, new units per year, and that's going to include both permanent and seasonal units, mostly permanent units in Georgian Bay. That's a little bit lower than the growth you've been experiencing over the last 5 years, but it's certainly higher than what you were experiencing prior to that period. And then on the employment side, it's about 25 jobs a year over the next 10 years, which is a little bit higher than what you've been experiencing. And it's certainly much higher than what was projected in the 2019 study. So I think one of the councillors earlier mentioned, the seasonality of many of the occupancy and many of the homes that are occupied here. For forecasting purposes, seasonal units, seasonal population are included in the calculation of the charge. They place demands on municipal services. They're going to be liable for the development charge in the same way as the permanently occupied units. Just one final thing about the forecast is that there is a requirement that councils consider area-specific charges when they're doing their development charge updates. It's not really applicable in Georgian Bay. Area-specific charges, which have different charges for different areas of a municipality, are really only used for water, sewer, and stormwater services. And so they're more applicable at the district level. I raise it because it's something we need to consider, but my advice would be that this township maintain the framework it always has, which is that everyone pays the same charge regardless of where they live in and build in Georgian Bay. The growth-related capital program for the next...
I think Councillor Hazelton wants to interrupt again.
Interrupting perhaps. So backing up 2 slides, I think it was you said on slide 6 there was a allocation of reserve fund balances for water, wastewater, and roads. And one of the things that is interesting and characteristic of our township is more than 50% of the properties on our township are water only access. So yeah, they do use roads to get to their properties, but they have it's not a dominant use. But water and wastewater, you just said a second ago that that's a district responsibility. And one of the things that that we have been pushing for a long time is recognition that every one of the water access properties, again, more than 50% of the properties in our township, access the water in front of their properties for consumption and use. And there is a significant cost associated with either maintaining the testing of that water to ensure that it's safe, and perhaps introducing remedial strategies when the water is not safe. Could you give us some indication as to how your studies have understood those costs and how we could leverage this development charges to help accommodate that?
Mr. Mayor, I'm afraid I can't because I'm not involved with the district study. And so it's that study that will be addressing the water and sewer requirements for growth over the next 10 years.
I think you may have misunderstood Councillor Hazelton. Councillor Hazelton, he's not talking about the properties that are serviced by water and sewer. He's talking about the properties that are, if I can use the phrase, serviced by the public waters, the Georgian Bay, the inland lakes. And that one of the things we do is do many tests to protect those waters. And it's something that I'm sure the province has not contemplated in these development charges. And I think his question was, is there a way that we can say that new development has to help pay for that water testing?
I apologize, Mr. Mayor. To the extent that the township then is spending capital dollars on this testing, then I would say that we could think about a portion of that cost as development charge eligible. But it sounds to me like a lot of that work would be an operating expenditure. So it would be ineligible on that basis.
Thank you.
Just thinking aloud here, Mr. Mayor, that may come up when we talk a little bit about roads and public works, because there'll be public works vehicles that are included in the charge here that might be related to that kind of work. So to a certain extent, we may well be capturing some of it. So just wanted to talk about the projects that are included in the charges that you're seeing today. So the main thing that I want to sort of stress to council is that the projects that are included in the background study and in your bylaw must be a reflection of your intentions. Recognizing that, you will still go through your capital budget process, you will still approve projects in the same way that you do every year. But you must, through this process, express your intent to maintain levels of service moving forward, to meet the needs of future growth. And that intention must be clearly set out in your capital budgeting documents, capital forecast documents, and in the background study itself. So the background study will list projects, timing, costs in some detail in order to meet that requirement. And the list that we've been using is based on three areas, three sources. One is the previous background study in 2019. One is your approved capital budget and your capital forecast documents. And the third is discussions we've had with each staff representatives for each of the services. And all of the cost deductions that I mentioned earlier have been made in the rates that you'll see today. This slide is a summary then of the capital program over the next 10 years for all of the 5 services, including the general government, which is now going to be renamed development related studies. And you can see in the first column of figures there, the total cost of all of the projects is just under $20 million. Moving from left to right now, there's about $1.2 million in grants or subsidies that are available to fund these costs. A significant component of these costs, particularly on the fire protection side, is related to work that will benefit existing residents. For example, through the replacement of existing fire stations with new fire stations. You have about $980,000 in reserve funds on hand that you can use to fund these costs. And so the costs that are being brought forward to the development charge calculation are the ones in the column that says 2024 to 2033. That's just under $3.5 million. And then there are some costs, particularly on the library side and the fire side, that are considered to benefit growth beyond the 10 years. So those will be mainly facility expansions, library facility expansions, fire facility expansions that will have benefits that accrue well beyond 2023. Those have been excluded from the charge as well. So it's the $3.5 million that's been brought forward to the development charge calculation. The charges will, as I said earlier, will vary by unit type. So there'll be larger charges for single and semi-detached units, and then smaller charges for rows and apartments. And there's two types of apartments that are in the bylaw. We've maintained the current structure of the unit types in calculating the charges. And somewhat unique to Georgian Bay, you also have a charge for park model trailers that is the same as the charge that is imposed on large apartments based on the occupancy of those units. And then on the non-residential side, it's a uniform charge for all non-residential development. So these are the draft calculated charges.
Before we do that, Councillor Bocek, I think, had a question on the last slide.
Yes, and thank you for all this presentation so far. The one thing that I've been constantly concerned about in developmental charges is two parts that we don't charge development fees on. One is large moored boats, and the other one is trailers, transient trailers. Both use our fire department, both use our roads, both use all of our services. And I'm just wondering if there's any room in this document to include them, because I think it's something that we have missed out on for years. And just your opinion on that, please.
Thank you, Councillor, and through you, Mr. Mayor. This is a very interesting question, and I may be a little bit out of my depth on the minutiae here, but so large moored boats, I think, in order to be liable for a charge, first of all, there has to be a trigger. And typically the trigger is a building permit. So I don't know whether those kind of things trigger a building permit or not. If they do, then I think that we should certainly consider charging them in the same way as we would for a home. Transient trailers. So the data that we use comes from Statistics Canada, which is sort of housing data. And that housing data does pick up mobile homes as a category. And those mobile homes we include in the single and the semi-detached unit count when we calculate the rate. So to the extent that Statistics Canada is picking up what you're describing in their mobile home category, we're factoring it into our calculations as well. But there may be some that are not picked up because they are sort of truly transient and never stop. I don't know enough about the sort of configuration of them to advise you on it.
Thank you for your comments. Perhaps it's the trigger mechanism here that is at fault, and it's not recognizing that we have seasonal residents that come up and spend the summer season aboard their vessel and use all of our services. So perhaps we can look at the trigger that gets those into a category where they could get development charges. And I know this isn't something we're going to solve today, but I thought I'd put the question out there to get my wheels moving to try and figure this out. So I appreciate your comments. Thank you.
Thank you. Go ahead.
So just then to summarize the residential charge. So on the left there, you'll see the charge by unit type. So it's $10,900 per single detached unit or semi-detached unit. Just over $7,000 for a row house, just over $6,000 for a large apartment, $4,800 for a small apartment. And then you see the park model trailer charge is the same as the large apartment charge. The vast majority of the charge relates to your roads, your services related to a highway, fire protection, and parks and recreation. And then the smaller components would be 7.1% for library services, and then the studies is about 5%. And then just a reminder that 5%, right now is ineligible and would come off the final charge under the current legislation. This is how those new charges compare with the current charges that are in force. So your current charge for a single detached unit is just under $7,000 a unit. So the new charge represents a $4,000 increase, or 57%. You can see that the increase is not the same across all of the services. The roads, for example, and the studies have come down a little bit, whereas the library, parks and rec, and fire have gone up. Part of the reason for the increase in those services is the cost escalation that we've seen, particularly on the building construction cost side of things, for things like new library buildings, fire stations, that kind of thing, park amenities. But also there are cost items that have been included this time around that were not in the previous background study. So in the previous background study, we did not have a provision for any library expansion. Now we do. We did not have any provision. Well, we had provision for one fire station expansion in the last study. Now we have provision for both the stations in Port Severn and MacTier.
Can I just ask one question? The background study, is it complete? Is it about to happen? Because sometimes I get the impression you're talking about it as it's still to come, and yet you're giving us all sorts of facts here that a lot of it has been done. Can you tell me what stage you are in the quote unquote background study?
Yes, Mr. Mayor, and I apologize. Maybe I should have started with that. That's in my final slide, but it's an important point. So the background study has not been drafted yet. The purpose of today is to give you a sense of what's going to be in it, but we are going to release it next Friday. It'll be released on the website for public consumption. We will go through a public process. It's not to say you can't make changes to it through that process, but all of this will be laid out in the background study.
So, but it's essentially, you've essentially done the great majority of your work on the background study.
We have done the vast majority of the work. There's one or two changes that we may have made because we've had discussions with staff over the last couple of weeks since this presentation was prepared.
Thank you for the clarification.
Thank you. Mr. Mayor, just a reminder too then that it's an $11,000 charge for a single detached unit, but it will be phased in. So in year one, it will be an $8,700 charge. In year two, a $9,200 charge. You will only get to the $11,000 charge in 5 years' time. So just wanted to compare the current charges and the calculated charges in Georgian Bay with some of the charges that we see in other places nearby. So this is going to cover the lower tier municipalities in the district, as well as some of the municipalities in the northern part of Simcoe County. This is the total charge payable. So the green component of the bar in any one place is the charge that's paid to the upper tier. And the gold component is the charge that applies and is imposed by the lower tier municipality. I suppose let's start with Georgian Bay's current charge, which is fourth from the bottom. You can see the majority of what people pay in Georgian Bay is for the district charge in green, but the total charge is around $23,700 for a single detached unit. The newly calculated charge in year one would push you up to just above the middle of the range there to $25,500 a unit. And by year five, when the fully phased in rate was in place, it would be around $27,500 a unit. A couple of points to make, I guess, is that you will see that there are charges for Muskoka Lakes, Gravenhurst, Huntsville that are lower than the current than the calculated charges that we presented to you today. So I can tell you that those municipalities are undergoing their studies right now, and some of the charges that are coming out of those studies are significantly higher than what's currently in place. So the Muskoka Lakes charge, which hasn't gone to council yet, so I can't really tell you what it is, but I will say it will be significantly higher than what it currently is, and if that council chooses to impose the full charge, it would be higher than your year five charge. Same goes for Bracebridge. If you look at Bracebridge at the top there, that charge of 31,000. So the fully phased in rate that's been calculated for Bracebridge is about 37,000. It's a lot higher than what's currently in place.
All right, I got a couple of councilors. I'm going to ask one quick question, then we're going to go to councilors Hazelton and Cooper, and that is this chart reflects, I'll call it full rates before discounts, because sometimes at least the upper tier they've discounted rates for certain situations.
Yeah, Mr. Mayor. So this reflects the charges that are actually in force, not the charges that they could have imposed in the past.
Okay.
Yeah.
Councilor Hazelton, please.
Thank you. I wanted to weigh in on a previous slide, but I don't want to derail your flow here. But I would like to get back to the topic that I brought up earlier and the mayor clarified for us, which is we have a unique requirement up here in our township. So if we have costs associated with roads, that's one thing, but we have costs associated with protecting our waters in our community. I would like to believe that in a similar way to us allocating charges for fire protection and road servicing, that we can carve out an understanding of what it costs us as a township to focus on the water and the water quality and the protecting the water, because our strategic plan basically says without clean water and a clean environment, we have nothing. So, it really doesn't matter whether we have a fire service or if we have roads. If we don't have clean water, then we have nothing. So surely there has to be a way that we can articulate the costs associated, and there could be significant capital costs, like if I have to buy a fire truck or a plow to deal with fires or roads, I may have to acquire capital equipment in the form of boats to be able to go out and sample the water and get detailed information about the water. So we don't have to talk about that right this second, but I wanted to find a time that makes sense to have that conversation today.
Through you, Mr. Mayor. I mean, I guess I would sort of just reiterate what I said earlier. To the extent that the township needs to spend capital dollars to expand fire vehicles or stations in order to meet the needs of growth in areas that are on large bodies of water, that's eligible for DC funding. It should be included in the development charge. Certainly, we've worked very closely with the fire chief to develop a capital program that is as you can see from the rates, quite costly. Certainly, if council wants to, well, we would encourage council to review the projects that are in the background study and see whether they are actually meeting the needs that the council is describing. And if they're not, we can certainly make a change.
Yeah, no, I think that, it's an important point in any equipment, be it lab equipment or boats or what have you, that staff would contemplate using for better water testing. I think we have to make sure that that is somehow included in this background study. And I'm seeing staff nodding heads, so I figure that's a positive sign that the message is getting through. Councillor Cooper. Oh, sorry. Councillor Hazelton, you had a follow-up comment?
Oh, I was just saying thank you.
Right. Councillor Cooper.
Thank you. And as a district councillor in Muskoka, if I could go to page 15, I wanted to reference something here that might be helpful in your comparison and analysis. Even though this study sounds like it's 99% complete, one of the things that is being brought out just in water testing alone here is something that really doesn't weigh in to the same degree with most of the areas that have been identified as being similar to us, whether it's Tay Township or Bracebridge or Oromada. I could read down the list, and the issue is that there's a couple of areas that are more similar to us that have not been included in your analysis, and I wonder why. So to our north, we have places like the Township of the Archipelago. We have Perry Sound. Perry Sound is, would be the Georgian Bay equivalent of Bracebridge, except that it's on a very large body of water. The Township of the Archipelago is primarily a water access community. Ours is 50%, theirs is 90%, 95% water access only, no roads. So, fire protection is an aspect, but water and water quality, as has been identified, is one of them. And I think it would be very useful for our study, and I'm sorry that this hasn't been pointed out, but it is a regular thing that I see, which is that we're compared to areas south of us and to the east of us, but never to the north. And I'm perplexed by that. Could you comment, please? Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. I'm through, Mr. Mayor. So I think that the rationale perhaps for excluding places like Seguin and Perry Sound and the Township of the Archipelago was simply that they weren't really facing the same kind of growth pressures that you are right now. So a lot of the growth that's occurred over the last 5 years in the district is related to sort of market forces, shall we say, and migration that's taking place from the south to the northern part of Simcoe and into the district of Muskoka. And we don't really feel that, Perry Sound and Seguin perhaps they're not immune to those forces, but they're not experiencing them in the same way. That being said, I'm quite happy, Mr. Mayor, to include those comparisons in all future presentations we make to council moving forward. We'll add them in, we'll present them at the public meeting and at any future presentations associated with the study. Happy to do that.
That would be greatly appreciated. Thank you.
If I could just add, just for your edification, if you do a Google travel to Huntsville and Perry Sound, I think you might even find that it's a shorter run to Perry Sound than it is to Huntsville. In fact, maybe even Bracebridge, because of the highways and the way they work. And I do a lot of traveling from the south, so I know a little bit about this, including traveling into Muskoka. So you're talking about sort of growth that's coming, a push from the south. And I'm just pointing out to you that there is a pressure coming up Highway 400 just as much as there is Highway 11. Thank you.
Certainly Seguin and Perry Sound are talking a lot about growth. What their percentages are to date and what your equivalent studies for there, I have no idea, but I think if you could include the figures, it would be interesting at the very least. Councillor Predko, please.
Thank you, and through you, Your Worship. My comments and the questions really are related to the comparison chart as well. And I was talking to CEO Mariotti yesterday about the difference between Tay and everybody else, and looking at their bylaw. Their township is responsible for water and wastewater, as opposed to the district or the upper tier, which obviously makes a huge burden on the township and their development charges. And similarly, I think Oro Medonte, the number you have provided here is for the general Oro Medonte, but there are areas in the Horseshoe Valley area that have a separate wastewater and water charge added to those residents, and that pushes them back up to around where the same place that Tay is. And I know, we don't have a breakout for from the district for areas that have a charge for water and wastewater added or not, but I'm wondering if there's some way to recognize on your comparison chart some of these differences in because it's not an apples to apples once we get out of our district for what is being used in the development charges. So I appreciate that we are substantially less than Tay, or if you were in the Horseshoe Valley area of Oro Medonte, but there are significant differences in how the upper tier and lower tier operate. So is that a valid comparison to where we are today? And I guess that's really my question for you right now.
Thank you, Councillor, and through you, Mr. Mayor. So yes, appreciate the point. It's very difficult to make these kinds of comparisons, and partly because of the issue you've raised, which is sometimes there are areas where these area-specific charges are layered on top of the general charges. There are also area-specific charges, by the way, in Ramera that we've not included in this chart. But again, we're happy to add more detail to this moving forward to reflect the area-specific charges that are in place in Oro Medonte and Ramera. And, we just add another color to the bar to reflect, those additional substantial charges where they exist.
Thank you. And my other follow-up observation is that I don't know all the differences between what's in development charges between our upper tier and the Simcoe upper tier, but if it's water and wastewater, it's a small amount compared to what Tay and the people in areas of Oro Medonte and even Severn would be paying. So it's that might be an economy of scale.
Yeah, and I wanted to follow up on that is when you have the green bar for upper tier, is that different if it was in Port Severn on a service lot or in Honey Harbor on an unserviced lot?
Yeah, Mr. Mayor, that's a very good point. So these would only apply in the serviced lot. So this is including the water and sewer charges at the district level that we've shown here. And to the councillor's question about the differences between Simcoe and Muskoka, yes, the water and sewer would be the main difference. But also point out here that this chart's not going to tell you anything about levels of service differences or servicing needs that exist. So, for example, the road servicing needs in Simcoe are much higher than they are in the district of Muskoka, and so their roads charge is a huge portion of their green bar that you're seeing here. Whereas it would be a very small portion of the bar in Muskoka, and the water and sewer would be a much larger component.
I would greatly appreciate it in your revised version if you were able, for our sake, to distinguish between the development charges that are be applicable to a new lot growth here in Port Severn where it's serviced, or in MacTier where it's serviced, versus Honey Harbor or anywhere else where they do not get water and wastewater. I would like to see that difference, please. Councillor Cooper.
Thank you. And just to reinforce, I think we need a little bit clearer chart that does indicate the fact that 50% of our residences do not get water and sewer at all. In fact, it's more than that. It's 50% are water access, but in addition, I don't remember the number exactly, but somewhere around 3 or 5% of our lots are serviced by water and sewer, and basically in MacTier and Port Severn. Those are the only places, but the huge number of residences are not in that area at all. So I think we're quite an anomaly. So when you see the green bar, we need to be as accurate as we can in terms of comparators. Otherwise, we get a distorted picture. So I would encourage a much more less distorted picture, because that's what I'm sort of surmising here. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's see if we can get to the end of your presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So the non-residential charge is $44 a square meter. And it's been calculated for the roads, the fire, and the studies. So there's no charge that's been calculated for Parks and Rec or library for the non-residential sector. The idea being there that it's the demand for those services is really driven by the residential development. So the non-residential charge compared with the current charge that's in place. So currently you have a $32 a square meter charge. So the $44 a square meter charge represents a $12 increase, or just under 40%. Again, mostly in the fire protection and roads area. And appreciating all the limitations that we've just heard about these comparisons. So for what it's worth, a couple of points to be made about the non-residential rates that are in place in Georgian Bay. You know, they are among the highest in the district. But the new charge would not change your relative position, even when it was fully sort of imposed in year 5. You'd still be in the mid-range of comparators, obviously excluding the municipalities to the north, but within the district, you'd still be among the higher there. But again, I need to stress that, you know, the Muskoka Lakes charge that we're working on right now is significantly higher, and the rate that we've currently calculated would be higher than your fully phased in year 5 rate, should that council choose to impose it. And then finally, you'll notice that Gravenhurst and Bracebridge don't currently have a non-residential charge. In Bracebridge's case, we've taken a rate to council for them to consider that would put that municipality at the top of the range, higher than the Muskoka Lakes charge that we've calculated, and higher than your year 5 charge. So again, these charts do not give you a sense of the charges that could be imposed. They're simply the charges that are actually in force. Yeah, Mr. Mayor, the reason why is they don't have a development charge bylaw.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Interesting. No development charge bylaw on Lake of Bays. Councilor Jarvis.
You're just going back to your pie chart page back on your non-residential charges. So non-residential development, I presume, is commercial industrial. Would that be basically it?
And institutional.
And institutional. And I'm disputing the way the pie chart is split up and how certain aspects of what we offer are not included in as being eligible for development charges from non-residential, and that I'm taking commercial, industrial, particularly, well, all 3 of those categories would be putting demands on Parks and Rec and libraries. Why would those 2 areas not be included in benefiting from these development charges?
Well, through you, Mr. Mayor, it's a topic of some discussion in this area, but I think the bottom line is that for two reasons. First of all, when libraries undertake their capital planning, they typically base it on population metrics. So they look at sort of floor space per capita, collection materials per capita. It's population that they study when planning for library capital needs. So developing a residential charge on the basis of population ties in quite nicely with the way libraries are planned for. But your point about non-residential activities using the library, we found over the years that most of the library use for employment activity is by work-at-home businesses. Work-at-home businesses and work-at-home employment is included in the residential component of the charge because their activities are occurring primarily in their residences. So we are picking up the demands on the library service when we calculate the residential charge. We are picking up the demands placed by the work-at-home employees when we calculate the residential charge. So there's less library use by the industrial sector and the commercial sector. There may be one or two people who sort of go to the library to print things or use the space, but it's not an integral part of their operations, and it's for that reason that we exclude it.
And Parks and Rec?
Parks and Rec, I suppose, would be a similar rationale in that most Parks and Rec master plans would base the parks needs and rec facility needs on population growth. So they're looking at per capita square foot, and parks needs, as you know, are based on sort of generally population metrics and location of housing development for local parks. But again, it's not to say that people who don't use the parks also work, but they're not using them on their work hours. So it's not tied into the operations of a business park, for example, or an industrial facility.
Just a piece of air, just further to that, I think the only reason anybody in those fields would be moving up into this area would be for access to amenities such as the lakes, harbors, whatever. And that would be the attraction for part of the attraction for being here. And I suspect, just to dispute everything here, is that I think that the number of the people that be using those, be employed by those organizations, would definitely be using Parks and Rec and the library facilities to some extent, maybe not to the extent that the residential community is using, but there is likely to be some use, particularly for the reasons of why any industrial, commercial, institutional organization would want to be in this area. Thank you.
All right, back to you.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So as we move through the process, we will be drafting a new bylaw for you, and the bylaw, as well as including the rates, will address matters such as who pays, and Bill 23. Of course, the requirements of Bill 23 will need to be incorporated into the bylaw. So there are some changes to the bylaw that are required to square it with the current legislation. We're going to be reviewing the definitions of different forms of development in the bylaw, and we've started those discussions with staff, and we will continue those over the coming weeks. Currently, you have exemptions set out in the bylaw. Some of them are statutory, so municipalities and school boards don't pay the DCs. That's under statute. Residential enlargements of existing homes don't pay DCs. That's under statute. You provide a redevelopment credit where somebody demolishes a home and rebuilds it within 3 years. they don't pay a development charge, provided they rebuild within 3 years. And then there's also a statutory exemption for the expansion of industrial buildings as well, as long as it's up to 50% of the existing building. Just other provisions that I don't imagine will need changing is, as I say, subject to your wishes, we're going to continue to treat park model trailers as large apartments, given the occupancy pattern, the similar occupancy patterns that exist between those two types of units. And there's an indexing provision in the bylaw that was introduced in 2019 that means that the rate is indexed annually automatically to keep pace with inflation. So that's a very common provision, and certainly it's almost universal in Southern Ontario to have that indexing provision. But
Would that affect this 80, 85, 90, 95 going forward, or would there be 80% of an indexed rate?
it'll be in 80% of an indexed rate. Yeah.
Councillor Hazelton.
Thank you. I have a question and a comment. Perhaps you indicate under the current exemptions, enlargements are exempt up to a certain GFA. What's a GFA?
It's a gross floor area.
No, I understand what GFA stands for. What is the GFA exemption?
Mr. Mayor, I don't have that at my fingertips, and I don't want to speculate because it's going to be very precise, but certainly we can get back with a proper answer to that question.
So my comment would be one of the things that you have listed here is expansions to industrial buildings of less than 50% are exempt. I'm wondering if that same policy should apply to residential expansions, or pick a number, because GFA may not be an appropriate target. But what we are seeing in our community is a huge number of applications coming through where they are seeking 100+% increase in the size. And so 100% enlargement, if you're going to only exempt industrial buildings at 50%, we need to, I think, to revisit the exemption for enlargements. Thank you.
We'll be sure to review that.
Thank you, Councillor Bochek. We're only one slide away to the end, so we're getting close.
I just want to revisit what you were saying about park models and how they would be treated as apartments. I can't be as eloquent as Councillor Hazelton in wording this, so I'm going to word it the only way I know how. If we have a trailer park that has transient trailers and that they install a foundation and they put up a park model, how do we charge them development charges when they don't own the property? It's the trailer park that owns the property. So I see some flaws. I see the need for it, but I see some flaws in how this would carry itself out. And I'm just wondering if there's been any thought to this to date, or is this something that our staff needs to get their head around and come up with a solution for? Thank you.
So, Mr. Mayor, my understanding is that for trailer parks, and again, I'm not sure quite what the councillor means by transient trailers, but certainly park model trailers, which are defined in your bylaw, my understanding is those would trigger a building permit. Who actually pays the charge, I suppose, will depend upon perhaps who owns the park and whether, if it's owned by the park owner, then that's the person who would have to pay the charge, but they're still liable for the charge because they're building a building permit. Whether that cost gets passed on by the park owner to the lot or trailer park individual trailer renters, I don't know, but be sure that if there is the trigger there, then the charge is liable and paid, and the bylaw contemplates that.
Thank you. And if I could follow up, obviously it goes back to the trigger. So, perhaps we need to visit all of our trailer parks and see, you know, maybe they've installed 40 foundations over the last 5 years and put park models in and we don't even know about it. So there's not the trigger of a building permit at this stage of the game. So again, thank you for your comments, and I think this will lead us, our staff, to understanding better what they need to do to capture these development charges from the people that are trying to evade them. So thank you for your comments. Appreciate it.
I think it's worth observing that if people are putting in foundations without a building permit, they've actually broken more than one rule. Councillor Predko.
Thank you. And I know we're trying to get to the end of the presentation, but this is the right moment for me to ask this question.
One way or another.
Yep. So just on the policies, you've been saying that, you know, this is a 10-year policy, and I noticed that there's some annual indexing that's part of the policy. But I'm really curious as to what the benefit of 10 years versus 5 years is, other than the fact that that's now allowed by the province. Is it that we don't have to do this review as frequently? Or because I wonder if there's more opportunity for fine tuning it over 5 years versus 10 years. And just, I guess it's a matter of opinion, but if it's in our policy, I'd like to understand why we're going with that. And as well, what would the annual indexing allow for? And that might mitigate some of the concerns about 5 years versus 10 years.
Through you, Mr. Mayor. So the 10-year lifespan of the bylaw is not a policy. It's a change to the legislation. You can amend your bylaw at any time before the 10-year expiry. So if you choose to update every 5 years and want to continue doing that, then you can certainly do that. And the mechanisms are there to allow you to do it. You'd still need to do a background study and have a public meeting, go through the process, but you can certainly do that. And by the way, a lot of fast-growing municipalities in the GTA are going to be doing that because their capital priorities change so quickly, and they can't just wait 10 years in order to respond to them. As far as the indexing goes, it's a prescribed index under the legislation, so it's the non-residential construction price index. And so you don't have any choice about that.
Okay. Thank you. I think that covers it off. Thank you.
Councillor Cooper.
Thank you. And just briefly, we've had a discussion about trailer parks and trying to figure out a way to collect some fees. And I would just add into that sort of consideration, we have a growing issue in terms of intensification and living multiple families at one residence with basically some of them being turned into yachting out stations, some with mooring buoys, but it's all residential uses. And there's costs associated with that, just like there would be in a marina or anywhere else. So add that to the list of things that we need to consider in order to recoup some of the costs for servicing these residential uses. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So last slide, I promise you. So just wanted to lay out exactly what we've done and where we are now and what we need to do in order to get to a bylaw in front of you. The analytical work is now complete, or would say 99% complete. We had a presentation with your senior management on March the 19th to do a very similar presentation as you've seen today. There's one or two changes arising from that meeting that are not reflected in the presentation today, but they are minor. We are sort of currently drafting the background study. We have a resolution for you today that we can release the background study next Friday on the basis of the information that you've received today. the background study has to be released 60 days before you pass the bylaw. So we've earmarked April the 4th for that release. We then go into a sort of a statutory consultation period. And we've earmarked May the 13th for a public meeting on these charges. So the public meeting, I would make a similar kind of presentation. The idea would be that we then come back to council on June the 3rd with, based on the feedback that's received through the consultation process, with a final bylaw and a rate schedule that we can put forward for your consideration on June the 3rd, recognizing that the bylaw expires on June the 10th. And there's some notification requirements after the bylaw is passed. And as I say, there's a 40-day appeal period as well. After that, the bylaw is insulated from appeal. Just a couple of other dates for you to be aware of that Muskoka Lakes is on a very similar trajectory. So we are going to council with the same presentation that you heard today, same structure, on April the 10th. The study released on April the 12th, and their bylaw expires the first week of July. And in Bracebridge, we went to council on March the 13th. The study has been released on March the 21st, and they expire on July the 5th. So those three municipalities are working on the same kind of line. Gravenhurst and Huntsville don't expire till the end of the year, so they're a little behind. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
And when does ours expire?
June the 10th.
So we better get on with it. You don't have much time to make changes that we've been talking about today.
Well, we have 2 months, and I'm not concerned about that timeline. The key for us is to get the background study out into the public sphere.
Fair enough. All right. Let's go with more questions, because I think that's part of the fun that we're doing today. We're going to start again with Councillor Bocek.
Thank you, and through you, Mr. Mayor. Just a question in general, no more specifics on this. This seems to fly in the face of Bill 23, which is a bit convoluted, but for the most part, build more homes faster. And by raising development fees, that seems to be in direct conflict to what the province is trying to obtain. And I'm wondering, being that Bill 23 has been a bit of a moving target, are we safe in presuming that we're going to be able to carry this forward and put this in place and not have any legislative problems with the province on this?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, the rates that we've shown you today and that would be set out in the background study, we believe will be the maximum rates you could impose under the current legislation and are perfectly defensible on that basis.
Okay, thank you.
Don't forget there are exemptions for certain properties, and that may be expanded by the province. We don't know. And we have the privilege of exempting properties from these charges if we so choose. Councillor Cooper, please.
I wonder if you could put up the last slide again, please, so that we can discuss the timing. I have some comments about the timing. And in particular, if you don't mind, what I think is important to remind ourselves is that 83% of our population are seasonal. April 4th is not actually in season, so to speak. So I'm concerned, even April 23rd, a lot of people don't come up to Georgian Bay for these 85% until the 24th of May. And we're pushing it here. We've identified today some information that we would like to hear or have included in the analysis, which will take a little bit of time. And I'm concerned that our timing is outside of our typical resident. And is there some reason that we have to have this completed by and passed by June 3rd? It couldn't be July 15th or August 3rd, so that we can make sure that we have the attention of those that are actually in residence. Could you answer that, please?
Through Mr. Mayor. So if you don't pass a bylaw by June the 10th, you will no longer be allowed to impose the charge. So that's sort of the drop dead date that certainly I've been working to. But it's certainly possible for you to delay implementation of the bylaw. It just means that if someone pulls permits in June or July or August, when there is no bylaw, then you cannot impose the development charge. I guess I just point out also that the statutory public meeting is scheduled for May the 13th. So I don't know whether that makes it a little easier for seasonal residents to attend on that date. Thank you.
If I could follow up, please, Mayor.
Please.
I'm a bit confused by the requirement of the dates, because you talked about other municipalities that are at later dates, and what's forcing us to have everything done by June 3rd? I'm not getting it. Perhaps you could explain that.
Yeah, certainly, Mr. Mayor. The expiry date is because of the date you passed the bylaw in 2019. So the current bylaws that are in place in the district have a 5-year lifespan from the date at which they were passed. So they vary, the expiry dates vary because of the staggered passage of the bylaws that took place in 2019. And it just so happened that this council passed its bylaw a few weeks before Bracebridge and Muskoka Lakes did, and that may be a legacy issue that goes back, several bylaws to when you first implemented a bylaw, and I don't remember that when that was. I think it was sort of in the late 90s.
Just a final follow-up question. So we can't pass a bylaw to say we want the date pushed out by 30 days or 60 days?
No, Mr. Mayor, you cannot extend the life of the bylaw beyond the expiry date.
So in 5 years' time, we're going to be in the same situation, which is the date that you're talking about here, and therefore it's before our season begins with the majority of our residents.
Well, the new bylaw will have a 10-year lifespan. So in theory, it'll be in 10 years. But the problem you're articulating is the same. I'm just trying to think of a way around this, and there is, I suppose, an option here to. You would still need to pass the bylaw on June the 3rd, but if you wanted to hold the current rates in place for a period of time, you could do that and have an effective date in the bylaw for the introduction of new rates, and then make a later decision as to, if you wanted to hold other public meetings over the summer to discuss that, you would then have to amend the bylaw if you chose not to implement the higher rates at a later date. So the mechanics of this, I think I'd have to think through a little bit more, but I think there's an option there to hold the current rates in place for a period of time before the new rates took effect. But you would still need to pass a bylaw before June the 10th, even to do that option.
Fair enough, and I would just like to say that as far as I'm concerned, the dates we're pushing the envelope here, and we're having public meetings before people are very interested in what's going on at Georgian Bay is what we have tended to do, and we should try and change our practices. And if there's a way to do that, I would highly recommend it. Thank you.
Thank you. I think I would just make one observation, is that development charges predominantly affect developers and new residents, not existing residents, because our existing residents won't have to pay development charges because they've already been developed. Councillor Hazelton, please.
transparency.
Perhaps we could let CEO Mariotti go ahead first.
Sure. CEO Mariotti.
Thank you, Mayor Kurtz. Yeah, you actually you actually just said what I was going to say. Other than yes, these charges mainly affect developers, and what we're going to be doing is Ms. Rattigan was telling me we're actually going to reach out to all the development community that we have as well to make sure that they're aware of this. And any public consultation will have a hybrid format as well, so that anyone who isn't up here in person will be able to at least join in remotely and you know, feedback from any location.
And I'm just going to add, my contacts within the marina industry tells me people are hoping to open up exceptionally early this year, given the weather. But that remains to be seen. Councillor Hazelton.
Thank you. I have 4 quick points here. I don't want to beat a dead horse, but this water quality management thing for me is huge. And when I think about services related to a highway or services related to fire, I can envision that services related to managing our water quality are very similar, but actually number 1 in our environmental strategy. So I think we need to look at that. I like the idea that Councillor Bocek talked about, which is understanding what the triggers are for trailer parks. So I think we need to look into that a bit further. Councillor Bocek also brought up the fact that we have live aboard boat marinas. And again, I think we need to understand what the trigger points are to drive development charges in that environment. It could be a new dock that is being designed for a new live aboard boat. And then finally, I mentioned this earlier, the expansions, exemptions. If we're exempting commercial businesses for 50% expansion, perhaps we should be looking at a similar exemption for residences and remove the GFA thing, which probably doesn't really fit that criteria. So those are my comments. Thank you.
And I'm going to add to what Councillor Hazelton just said in 2 things. One is I think if we're looking at, it should be a combination of GFA and percentages if we're looking at residential expansion, because if you have a 500 square foot cottage versus a 5,000 square foot cottage, percentages can be hugely different. So I think we need a combination. And I also think, as he brought up, we have to seriously consider floating accommodations. They've been an issue in the last couple of years, and I know one form of development that some people are considering applying for is getting floating accommodations permitted at marinas. And in other words, these would be float homes that are connected to the marina services of whatever form they may be. And they don't have that, I'll call it approval at this point, but I would like to see that if we're going to permit a new resident of any description, development charges should be applicable one way or another. And I think that's a very important point. Councillor Bocek.
Thank you. And through you, Mr. Mayor, I'm wondering if once we reach that June date where we kind of put things in cement, if we could have a report back stating what the district development charge increases are as well. Obviously, our residents use the ambulatory service of the district, and many of the features that the district give us services. And for a developer to understand what the complete increase would be if they're looking to do development here from the district point and from the township point, I think it would be a better approach to give that information to anybody who's wanting to develop here and not hide it from them. So if somewhere along the line here, if district approves their increases to development charges and we get ours done, then maybe we could have some sort of press release letting people know. So just if that could happen at that time, that would be appreciated as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments at this point? Councillor Hazelton.
One quick last comment. I really love the statement that was on the bottom of one of the slides earlier in the deck, where it was where was it here? Is the principle, growth pays for growth. It's almost like that that statement needs to be kind of a footer on every slide, so that we all understand what the focus is here. We're not looking to charge development charges because we like to, but we're looking to make it a user pay, growth pay kind of concept, and I think that needs to be highlighted. Thank you.
Thank you. Of course, that's one item that's been debated enthusiastically over the decades, because some municipalities are so keen on growth that they want everybody else to pay for it. But I suspect you can imagine what Councillor Hazelton thinks about that approach. All right, I'm not seeing any more hands, so I have a motion in front of me, and it's Councillor Graziano.
Thank you. Through your worship, I was waiting to hear everyone's comments before I decided to jump in and join the foray. A couple of concerns that I have, and I've taken some notes here. You know, I've been in this community now for decades, and I have not seen any capital growth with regards to our township. You know, I haven't seen very much growth with regards to the municipality and specifically from development charges. I've heard constituents and developers through the course of my tenure as a councillor, as well as in campaigning, complain that the development charges are already way too high. And I think it was supported earlier by the comment of the gentleman that we have here today, in that he did advise that we do have a higher DC, or we do have higher DCs relative to perhaps other municipalities. And we are hearing that from the constituent standpoint as well. A lot of that chatter came from MacTier, believe it or not. As I went through the community, development charges seem to be quite high, and is prohibiting development within that community as well. I believe we already have a marketability issue when it pertains to attracting developers to our area. And I question the logic here that we and our approach with respect to increasing DCs. If we already have a marketability issue, and if we're already perceived within the development community as being hard to acquire permits, I think higher DCs are going to work against us, not in our favor. And as a result, by increasing DCs and decreasing demand, well, then we are not really going to see any net difference here. We may, in fact, do more harm than good by increasing our DCs when it pertains to acquiring interest in developing within our community. And so, again, I'm kind of concerned that this approach is not necessarily going to be in our best interest and doing what it's intended to do, which is to help put money back into our capital, you know, in our pockets. Rather, it's going to hinder development, and it's going to make us less attractive from a development perspective. So that's my comments. Thank you.
Thank you. Actually, I had one question I didn't ask, but I think I know the answer. The development charges, by legislation, they're a flat rate per unit as opposed to like a percentage of the value. Is that correct?
Well, Mr. Mayor, the legislation doesn't actually prescribe how the rates are to be structured. So there's some flexibility, or discretion, I should say, given to municipalities to structure the charge the way they want. However, there has to be some relationship between the charge that's imposed and the demand for services arising from, you know, each sector or each type of charge. And there's never really been a good justification in our minds for charging a higher charge on the basis of the assessed value of a unit on that basis. So the reason why there's higher charge for larger units is because there's more people living in the units generally. And so to the extent that it's, people driving the need for services, then that's kind of the connection there.
Fair enough. All right, Councillor Bocek?
Before we read the resolution, just a question for clarity for my own purposes. We have a bill to pay as a township, and that bill you're saying is going to be helped to be paid by development charge increases to provide the services we currently provide and future services that we're going to provide. If we didn't increase the development charges to new development, would that not fall back on the ratepayers as a tax increase? You have to get that money from somewhere. So you can either charge the new development that's going to happen, or you can put the burden on the residents that currently live here by increasing their taxes. Am I reading this right? There's really only two methods that we're going to gain these revenues. It's either through existing tax increases or increasing the development charges.
Mr. Mayor, for growth-related capital, that is generally correct.
Thank you.
So I have moved by Councillor Bocek, seconded by Councillor Predko, that be it resolved that council receive the information from Hemson Consulting Limited regarding the development charges background study, and that on the basis of the information received, council directs Hemson Consulting Limited to proceed with the development charges background study and next steps under the Development Charges Act. All those in favor?
Can we get a registered vote? Sorry.
Sure.
Thank you.
All right, so I'm going to turn the vote calling then over to our clerk.
Let the record show that Councillor Graziano requested a recorded vote. Councillor Graziano, how do you vote?
No, thank you.
Councillor Bocek, how do you vote?
Yes.
Councillor Cooper, how do you vote? Let the record show that Councillor Cooper voted yes. Councillor Hazelton, how do you vote?
Yes.
Councillor Jarvis, how do you vote?
Yes.
Councillor Predko, how do you vote?
Yes.
Mayor Kutsier, how do you vote?
Yes.
Let the record show that the motion carries 6-1.
Thank you. All right. Next on our agenda is a closed session, and I believe that involves invited guests. So, okay, so we're going to take a 20-minute break and reconvene at, well, let's say 11 o'clock even, we're going to reconvene. So that's an 18-minute break, and we'll see you then. Thank you.
You'll have to join the Teams link for closed.
Sydney, do we need to return to this meeting after closed so we can end the meeting for the day?
Sorry, it was muted there. Yeah, so we're going to return to this link, but you can close out for now. I'm going to keep the Zoom running so you can leave and return after.
All right, we're gonna reconvene this meeting at 11:02. And I have moved by Counselor Predko, seconded by Counselor Bocek. Whereas Section 239(2) of the Municipal Act 2001, as amended, provides authority for councils and municipalities to close a meeting or parts of a meeting to the public if the subject matter pertains to a matter identified in Section 239(2). And whereas the Council of the Township of Georgian Bay deems it necessary to close this portion of the meeting in order to address matters under the following sections of 239(2). Ontario Land Tribunal Appeal OLT 24-000141, which is Santoro or 862 Haskets Drive. Litigation or potential litigation, including matters before administrative tribunals affecting the municipality advice that is subject to solicitor-client privilege, including communications necessary for that purpose. Now be it resolved, the Council of the Township of Georgian Bay moves into closed session of council at 11:03 a.m. All those in favor? And in that room, okay, I have a majority saying in favor, so that is carried. Thank you. Okay.
Got quorum.
All right. So I have moved by Councillor Jarvis and seconded by Councillor Predko. And by the way, Councillor yeah, there we are. Be it resolved, the Council Township of Georgian Bay rise from closed session at 12:21 p.m. All those in favor? 1, 2, 3, and I make 4, and down underneath the desk is 5. So we got at least 5 in favor. So that is carried. Moved by Councillor Hazelton, second by Councillor Bocek. Be it resolved, the Council adopts bylaw 2024-025 to confirm the proceedings of the March 28th, 2024 Council meeting. All those in favor? And I got 5 votes again, and that is carried. And moved by Councillor Bocek, seconded by Councillor Jarvis. Be it resolved, the Council does now adjourn at 12:22 p.m. until April 8th, 2024 at 9 a.m. or at the call of the chair. All those in favor? And that is carried, and we are adjourned. Thank you very much.